Hello everyone. In this video, we'll be talking about the skeletal system. Now, fair warning, skeletal system is one of our bigger units of the semester, but don't worry, we'll break it down into manageable parts and I'll guide you through everything step by step. We'll start with the axial skeleton, which includes the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. These bones form the central core of your body and protect some of your most vital organs. For example, the brain, the heart, and the spinal cord. There you go. The other half of the skeleton is the appendicular skeleton. That'll include the arms, the legs, and the girdles that attach them to the axial skeleton. In this first video, we'll just focus on the skull. We'll look at the major cranial and facial bones, and then we'll talk about some of the key bone markings that you'll need to recognize. So let's get into it. Notice first that I put 3 skulls up here for you. 2 of them are colored and unrealistic, but helpful for learning the different bones because some of them are kind of weird and they pop up in a bunch of different places and it helps us find those bones. You'll see that each bone has its own color. So if the same color shows up somewhere, that means it's a part of the same bone. All right, here we have a more realistic looking skull model where it's going to be kind of more homogeneous in appearance. You will need to recognize the different bones and features and various markings on both types of skull models. I will show you mostly on our colored models, but again, when we're in lab, make sure you practice on both of them. All right, now, when you look at the skull, you'll see that the cranial bones form the cranium, right? That's the part that encases the brain. So here are the major cranial bones that you'll need to identify. First and foremost, we have our frontal bone. That's this guy in purple here. Notice that this frontal bone is going to form the forehead, and it's also going to form the roof of the eye sockets, because look, right? If I go like this, here you can see the frontal bone is still there. And if I open this guy up, you can see it in here as well. See, this is all the frontal bone. Then when we go back, we see the parietal bones. These are 2 different parietal bones, okay, but they're both called parietal bones. These are clearly forming much of the top of the cranium as well as some of the sides. Then when we look at the back of the skull, we see the occipital bone here. The occipital bone forms the back and the base of the skull here in green. When we look at the side, we see the temporal bone. We have one on each side. Notice that the temporal bone is also all of this in this color. You can also see it on the inside. Okay, so here we're seeing the frontal bone, the temporal bone, the occipital bone, and parts of the parietal bones as well. Okay. You'll also need to know the names of the joints that secure or hold those cranial bones together. This one right here that's joining the parietal bones with the frontal bone is our coronal suture. Coronal, just like the plane we studied. Here we see the sagittal suture, again, just like the plane, right? Remember the sagittal suture divides the body up into left and right sides, just like this one here, which is joining our 2 parietal bones together. In the back, oops, he fell, decapitated him. All right, well, kind of. All right, in the back here, we see our lambdoid suture. That's this guy here, which is joining our occipital bone to our parietal bones. And then on each side on this kind of flat portion here, we have the squamous suture, and that makes sense because this is kind of flat. And remember when we looked at tissues, we saw those squamous shaped cells, which were flat. Okay, so flat and flat, so squamous suture. Now let's look at the face, okay? When we look at the face, we see that there are about 14 major bones that we want to talk about that are going to shape the face and support structures like the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. Okay, so very important. First, we're going to start off with the only movable bone in the skull. And these don't actually have it attached, so I'm going to grab it for us here. And I'll show you this one on this model. And we can see that this bone, this mandible, okay, this is our mandible. And this is going to articulate right here at something called our mandibular fossa, which is this part right here, our mandibular fossa. And these guys fit right in here, and look at that, the only movable bone. Okay, there we go. All right, so that's our mandible. Let's take this guy again. This one here, this is our maxilla. Notice that our maxilla is pretty big. Look at that. It's all of this, okay? And it's also right here, okay? That's going to be important because I may ask you to also identify the palatine bone, which is this guy right here. And this palatine bone is forming the back part of the hard palate. Okay, and it's not this. A lot of people mistake it for this. That's still the maxilla. This here, that's your palatine bone. And notice that you can also see it here as well. Okay, right there, same color. All right, we have our zygomatic bones pictured in blue. We have our nasal bones right here and here, forming the bridge of your nose. We have the vomer. The vomer, I'm going to move over. Actually, no, I can show you that on this model. The vomer is right in here, okay? This is forming part of your nasal septum. The other part of your nasal septum is going to be formed by your ethmoid bone, The ethmoid bone is a kind of weird, funny shaped bone right in the center of your face, okay? And that's actually going to be working to form your cranium as well, along with the other bones I mentioned. And that ethmoid bone is going to show up in a few places. This is one of those ones that I would say you should definitely Google and look at in 3D by itself because it's pretty weird shaped, but you'll see it pop up right here. You'll see it pop up in here in yellow. You see that? And over here, you see it in here, okay? Forming that kind of, oh, there we go, sorry. Kind of forming that upper part of that septum right there. Okay, there you go. So you'll see it in a number of places. Again, please make sure to go ahead and Google it because that will be helpful for you. And you'll also see another bone, which is our sphenoid bone, and that's this guy right here. So in green, so we have this here, we have this underside in green, and this right here, and we also see it right here, okay? All right, so that's our sphenoid. All right, coming back, so we've got, where were we? We were at our vomer, Okay, so remember this was our vomer forming this kind of bottom portion of our nasal septum. And we'll also see it right here. See that gray color? That's also part of your vomer. That's another one you can benefit from looking at individually by just Googling it. Wikipedia actually has very good 3D images where you can isolate these structures. All right, here we can see our lacrimal bone. So that's this guy right here and this guy in pink right here. These are where the tear ducts are, and these are not to be confused with your ethmoid bones, which are or parts of your ethmoid bone, which are found just behind it, right? So again, in yellow here, that's your ethmoid, and this in pink, that's your lacrimal. All right, now if we go back and we look inside the nose, we see that we have a couple of conchae. And I'm saying conchae because it will remind you of the shape of a conch shell. The conch shell kind of has that curled shell. And here you can see it's kind of curled, okay? So we have our inferior conchae here and our middle conchae here. All right, so again, I'm saying it that way because it reminds us of the conch shell, but you'll also hear me refer to it as the inferior and middle concha, okay? All right, so again, and you have that on both sides, okay? All right, now let's go ahead and look at key markings. So we'll start with our mandible. If you look at our mandible, we see that we have this flat part of our mandible called the mandibular ramus. Again, that's this whole flat portion here, okay? Or the vertical portion. It's right here, mandibular ramus. And then we have a couple processes that stick off. Now, when I say process, you're gonna see these as kind of pointy-offy pieces of bone. Right? So whenever I say process, I want you to look for something that kind of points off of the bone. Right? So here we have two processes that are going to be really important to know. The first bump here, that's your coronoid process, and this one here is your condylar process. You'll also hear us call that your mandibular condyle. Okay? So coronoid process and mandibular condyle or condylar process. And you'll see that your mandibular condyle will actually articulate with your mandibular fossa here. All right, so if you see your fossa, okay, your mandibular fossa right here, notice that we're gonna come in and we're just gonna stick that right in there. And look at that, right? So your mandibular condyle articulates with your mandibular fossa. And then remember, this is your coronoid process right here. And this is how we can remember that. Okay, look at that. This here, this is your coronal suture, right? So coronoid process is under your coronal suture. Okay, and again, to remember the last one, right, your mandibular condyle is going to articulate with your mandibular fossa. Okay. All right, I have a few more here. So let's look at, if we look at these holes here, you'll hear me refer to holes as foramen a lot of times, foramen. So these here, these are your mental foramen, and that makes sense because remember when we looked at our anatomical terminology, we said that this region here was your mental region or your chin, right? Your chin was your mental region. Okay, so your mental region will have mental foramen or holes. we also have mandibular foramen, and these are inside the jaw. And you'll see these on the inside right here and here. Okay, so mental foramen on this side and mandibular foramen back here. We also see some more foramen, okay? And remember, foramen means hole, right? So we'll see some more foramen, and actually I like them better over here. So let's look at this model. We'll see supraorbital foramen, where supra means above. And we'll see infraorbital foramen, where infra means under. Okay, so infraorbital foramen, sorry, right there, and supraorbital foramen. Now, if we look at the bone markings or features on the temporal bone, we'll see that we have this part right here. Okay, this is where your ear canal is. Okay, so this is called your external auditory meatus. You can also call it the external acoustic meatus. Then we have a couple more processes. We've got this kind of bigger one right here. It's fatter, right? And then we have this really, really pointy one right here. Can you see that? This guy. So this kind of fat one, and then this pointy one. This fat one is going to be called our mastoid process. And I remember that by thinking about the dog, the bull mastiff, right? A mastiff is a really big dog breed. They're kind of bulky, right? Just like this guy is kind of bulky, okay? So mastoid process. And a styloid process, those are pointy, right? Whenever you see a styloid process as a bone marking, it's going to be pointy. And that's because it's pointy like a stylus, okay? A stylus is pointy. So styloid process, mastoid process. External acoustic meatus. And then again, we have our mandibular fossa here, okay? So this is showing you just with bone. And here you see it represented slightly differently. So you can see it either way, okay? There you go. Now, here's an interesting thing, all right? So this thing here, this thing that forms a kind of arch, well, that's called your zygomatic arch. And that makes sense because this is your zygomatic bone. So your zygomatic arch is the arch that comes off of your zygomatic bone. Okay, so again, here's your zygomatic bone, and here's the arch. But here's where it gets weird, okay? This zygomatic arch is made up of two smaller processes that are sticking off their larger bones and forming that arch. You have this process coming off of the temporal bone, and you have this little process here, this one right here, coming off of the zygomatic bone, right? Now, this process and this process, they're actually named after the structures that they're going to meet. So this one here, while this is the temporal bone, this is called the zygomatic process. This is the zygomatic bone, but this is the temporal process. So zygomatic bone, temporal process, zygomatic process, temporal bone. Please study that one. You don't want to get it mixed up on the exam. Now, when we look at the occipital bone, we see some features there as well. The first one being this kind of flat part here. Okay, you'll see this piece that kind of sticks out. You see that right here and this right here. Those are called the occipital condyles. These are smooth, rounded surfaces next to the foramen magnum. And these, I'll show you that in a moment, and these will articulate with the first vertebra. And I'll show you, if I can, what that looks like in my next video. let me show it to you on this skull. So here, you see how these kind of stick off here? These are your occipital condyles. Okay, and let me show you this view, occipital condyle. This guy here, this is your foramen magnum. Now remember, foramen means whole. Magnum means big, so that literally translates to whole big, okay? Because it's a big hole, right? So foramen magnum, whole big, big hole. All right. We will also see a couple more foramen, okay? So for example, if we want to look, let me see if I can find, all right. So if I look here, you can see that you have a hole right here, okay? This is your jugular foramen, okay? Your jugular foramen. You will also see right here your carotid canal. Jugular foramen, carotid canal, foramen magnum. I'm not going to ask you about the rest of these, though you may see this one on a quiz with me. And this is the foramen ovale. Okay, foramen ovale. This is the foramen lacerum here. All right. All right, so moving on. Let's look at, let's go to the internal portion here. Okay, now if we go to this internal portion of the skull, okay, I've already pointed out a number of these bones, but remember, we also want to look at the bone markings. So we will see here, we see the sphenoid bone. Remember, the sphenoid bone is this one right here. Remember, we saw it here, here in yellow, here, and here. So it's kind of this butterfly-like shaped bone down here. All right, so this is gonna have a couple things. First, we want to locate our lesser wing of our sphenoid bone and our greater wing. We'll see that the lesser wing looks like a stingray. You see that? The greater wing looks like a butterfly. Don't get these confused with this. This is not anything on your sphenoid. This is a different bone entirely. That's your temporal bone, okay? So lesser wing of sphenoid, greater wing of sphenoid. You'll also see that we have this structure right here. And this is your sella turcica. Sella turcica. That's that little kind of crib-shaped bone right there. Okay, and what this is going to do is it's going to hold your pituitary. You'll see the pituitary when we go on to talk about the brain, and it's going to be a little gland. It's going to hang down, and it's very delicate. And so we're going to hold it right here because it's very important. So we're just going to cradle it in this little sella turcica, this little crib-shaped thing here. This is why often when we do dissections, we won't see it because it'll get ripped off when you take it out of the skull. We will also see, remember how I said we had that funny shaped ethmoid bone? Well, we also have some features of the ethmoid bone that we want to remember. Now remember, we see it in a few places. We saw it here. We saw it in here, forming this upper part of the septum. And we also see it right here. Now that flat portion, right, the kind of base of this flat portion here, that's going to be called the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. That's the flat portion, this kind of red looking flat portion here. And then we see this piece that's kind of sticking off like a shark fin. That's going to be called our crista galli. Again, that's the piece that's sticking up like a shark fin. And let me show it to you on another model. Just give us a little more perspective. Here, we can see it sticking up, okay? That's our crista galli. I mentioned before that we have cranial meninges, and this is where our cranial meninges are gonna come and attach, right? It's gonna wrap around the brain and then come and attach there at the crista galli and curviform plate. And here we see it again in yellow. The flat part here, that kind of top portion of the ethmoid bone, that's gonna be the cribiform plate, and the part that's sticking up there like a shark fin, that's our crista galli. All right, now I believe that's it for our first video on the bones, our video on the skulls. We've covered the cranial and the facial bones and their structures and a bunch of other important markings that you'll need to recognize on the model and or in images if you're taking my quizzes in lab. All right, in the next video, we'll continue with other parts of the axial skeleton, and then we'll take a look at the appendicular skeleton. All right, bye.